Let's get right into it. Number 9. The Horny Vikings. Picture a Viking. Go on. Close your eyes. You're seeing a giant bearded man with an axe, probably screaming as he leaps off a longship, and he's definitely wearing a helmet with 2 giant horns sticking out of it. It's the universal symbol of a Norse warrior, the kind of headwear that says, "I'm here to pillage your village and then attend a very aggressive heavy metal concert." Except it's complete garbage. The Vikings never ever wore horned helmets, not once. Archaeologists have dug up plenty of Viking-era sites, unearthing swords, shields, and actual perfectly functional helmets. And you know what none of them have? Horns. Because strapping 2 giant handles to your head in the middle of a sword fight is, to put it mildly, a catastrophically stupid idea. It's like entering a boxing match wearing a helmet with a convenient punch here sign painted on it. Any self-respecting Saxon or Frank would just grab a horn, twist, and turn your glorious Viking neck into a sad, deflated pretzel. So where did this iconic, idiotic image come from? The opera. Seriously. In the 1870s, a composer named Richard Wagner staged his epic opera cycle, Der Ring der Nibelungen, and his costume designer, Carl Emil Doppler, decided the Norse characters needed a little extra flair. He slapped some horns on their helmets to make them look more dramatic and pagan for the 19th century audience. The image was so striking that it just stuck. It got picked up by artists, illustrators, and eventually, cartoonists. So the enduring image of the fearsome Viking warrior wasn't forged in the fires of Scandinavian conquest, but in the backstage dressing room of a German opera house. Basically, an entire civilization's headwear got retconned by a guy who really, really liked dramatic entrances. Number 8. The Napoleon Complex. You've heard of the Napoleon Complex, right? That delightful term for a short person, usually a man, who overcompensates for their lack of height with an aggressive, domineering personality. It's named after Napoleon Bonaparte, the tyrannical French emperor who was famously, legendarily, comically tiny. A pipsqueak who tried to conquer the world to feel like a big boy. It's a fantastic story. The only problem is Napoleon wasn't actually short. At the time of his death, he was measured at 5 feet 2 inches in French units. But here's the kicker. The French inch was longer than the British inch. When you do the conversion, Napoleon stood at about 5 feet 7 inches tall. The average height for a Frenchman at the time was around 5 feet 5 inches. So, far from being a tiny terror, Napoleon was slightly above average. So why does history remember him as a man who needed a step stool to get on his horse? 2 words. British propaganda. The Brits were Napoleon's #1 enemy, and they were masters of the political cartoon. They couldn't always beat him on the battlefield, but they could absolutely roast him in the papers. They relentlessly portrayed him as a comically small, tantrum-throwing child, often dwarfed by his own hat. They called him Little Boney, and drew him as a pint-sized menace stomping his feet. It was one of the most successful smear campaigns in history. They took a man of average height, and through sheer, repetitive mockery, convinced the entire world he was a shrimp. So, the Napoleon Complex is named after a man who didn't even have it, all because his enemies were really, really good at Photoshop, 1800s style. Number 7. Washington's Wooden Smile. George Washington. The stoic father of a nation, the man on the dollar bill, the guy who could not tell a lie. He's also famous for his terrible dental hygiene, and the story goes that he wore a set of clunky, uncomfortable wooden teeth. It's a classic elementary school fun fact, painting a picture of a president grimacing with a mouthful of splinters. This one is a half-truth wrapped in a very uncomfortable lie. Washington did have absolutely horrific teeth. By the time he was inaugurated, he only had one of his own teeth left. He wore dentures, and they were, by all accounts, a nightmare. They were painful, bulky, and made it hard for him to speak. But they weren't made of wood. His dentures were constructed from a horrifying potpourri of materials. We're talking hippopotamus ivory, brass screws, gold wire, and get ready for it, real human teeth. Yes, the first president of the United States had a mouthful of other people's teeth, likely purchased from poor people, or extracted from the mouths of enslaved individuals on his plantation. Sometimes animal teeth, like those from a horse or donkey, were filed down and included in the mix. The ivory base would get stained and cracked over time, which might have given it a grainy, wood-like appearance, which is likely where the myth started. So, the reality is somehow even more disturbing than the myth. We imagine him with a charmingly rustic, Pinocchio-style grin, when in fact his mouth was a grim, cobbled-together museum of mismatched parts, held together by metal springs that forced his jaw open. No wonder he looks so miserable in all his portraits. Number 6. Einstein the math failure. There's a comforting little story that gets told to every kid struggling with algebra. It's a beacon of hope for anyone who has ever stared at a calculus problem until their brain started leaking out of their ears. The story is that Albert Einstein, the literal synonym for genius, failed math as a schoolboy. See? Even the smartest person in history had trouble with fractions. So it's okay if you do, too. This is, and I say this with all the love in my heart, a big fat lie designed to make us feel better about our own mediocrity. Einstein never failed math. In fact, he was the opposite, a mathematical prodigy. He himself said that by the time he was 15, he had mastered differential and integral calculus. He was so advanced that he found his regular school curriculum boring and tedious. He wasn't failing, he was just way ahead of the curve. The myth likely started from two sources. First, he did fail an entrance exam to a polytechnic school in Zurich, but he passed the math and science sections with flying colors. He failed the non-science subjects like French, because he was, a German kid who was really focused on math and physics. The second source of confusion comes from his report cards, where at one point he received a grade of 6 in math. Years later, people saw this and assumed it was a failing grade. But the school had recently reversed its grading system, where a 6 was actually the highest possible grade. So, the story of Einstein the dunce is the result of a misunderstanding about a Swiss grading system. It's not a tale of a late bloomer who overcame his academic struggles. It's a story about a genius who was so smart, his report card later confused people. Sorry, kids. You'll have to find another excuse for not doing your homework. Number 5. Burn the Witch. The Salem Witch Trials of 1692. It's one of the darkest and most bizarre chapters in American history. When you think of it, you probably imagine a mob of stern-faced Puritans, torches held high, tying a woman to a wooden stake and setting her ablaze as she screams her innocence. The phrase witch burning is burned into our collective consciousness. But here's the thing, not a single person was burned at the stake in Salem. The entire witch burning image is an import from Europe, where burning at the stake was a common method of execution for heresy. The American colonies, however, operated under English law. In England, the legal punishment for witchcraft wasn't heresy, it was a felony. And the punishment for a felony was hanging. And that's exactly what happened. Of the 19 people convicted and executed as witches in Salem, all of them were sent to the gallows and hanged. Another man, Giles Corey, who refused to enter a plea, was crushed to death with heavy stones, a horrific practice called peine forte et dure, but still not burned. Several others died in prison. The myth of witch burning in America is so pervasive because it's more dramatic, more visceral. Fire feels more archaic, more primal, more fitting for the superstition of the era. But the reality was a cold, legalistic process that ended with a rope. It wasn't a frenzy of fiery mob justice. It was a state-sanctioned series of executions based on spectral evidence and mass hysteria, which in some ways is even more chilling. It's a nice reminder of one of America's oldest traditions, an obsession with due process, immediately followed by a public execution. Number 4. Let them eat cake. Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before the Revolution, has gone down in history as the ultimate symbol of an out-of-touch, air-headed aristocrat. And it all comes down to one infamous quote. Upon being told that the starving peasants of France had no bread, she supposedly scoffed and replied, "Qu'ils mangent de la brioche," or, "Let them eat cake." It's the perfect soundbite. In one short sentence, it encapsulates the clueless cruelty of a monarchy completely disconnected from the suffering of its people. It's the phrase that launched 1,000 guillotines. The only tiny issue is that she almost certainly never said it. Historians have scoured her letters, the diaries of her contemporaries, and court records, and there is zero evidence that she ever uttered those words. In fact, the phrase itself was already floating around long before Marie Antoinette was even on the scene. A very similar line appears in the writings of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who attributed it to a great princess. But he wrote it when Marie Antoinette was just a child living in Austria. It seems to have been a sort of pre-existing political proverb, an anecdote used to criticize the callousness of the rich. During the French Revolution, radical journalists and propagandists needed a villain, and the foreign-born extravagant queen was the perfect target. They dredged up this old anonymous quote and pinned it on her. It was a brilliant piece of character assassination. It was catchy, it was damning, and it was easy to believe. It turned her from a person into a caricature of aristocratic evil. She was basically the first victim of being, quote, tweeted, with a fake inflammatory caption that went viral and got her beheaded. Number 3. Columbus and the Flat Earth. The story of Christopher Columbus is often told as a tale of brave, singular genius against a backdrop of medieval ignorance. You know the one. In 1492, everyone in Europe, from the peasant to the king, believed the world was flat. They thought if you sailed too far, you'd just fall off the edge into a sea of monsters. But Columbus, a visionary, knew the earth was round. He bravely sailed west to prove it, defying the flat earthers and discovering America in the process. This entire narrative is a steaming pile of historical fiction. First off, no educated person in 15th century Europe thought the world was flat. The fact that the earth is a sphere had been established science for nearly 2,000 years, ever since the ancient Greeks calculated its circumference with surprising accuracy. Sailors, scholars, and monarchs all knew the world was round. The debate wasn't about the shape of the earth. It was about its size. The experts of the day believed the planet was much, much larger than Columbus thought it was. They argued that the distance to Asia by sailing west was impossibly far, and that any ship attempting it would run out of food and water long before reaching land. And you know what? They were absolutely right. Columbus's calculations were wildly, comically wrong. He drastically underestimated the size of the Earth. He got incredibly, stupendously lucky that two entire continents happened to be in the way. If North and South America weren't there, he and his crew would have starved to death in the middle of a vast, empty ocean. He wasn't a hero proving the world was round to a bunch of idiots. He was an overconfident navigator who was really, really bad at math and stumbled into a hemisphere that nobody in his world knew existed. Number 2. Van Gogh's ear. Vincent van Gogh, the ultimate tortured artist. He's the poster boy for suffering for your art, a man of immense talent and even more immense mental anguish. And the story that perfectly crystallizes his madness is the tale of his ear. In a fit of insanity, he took a razor, sliced off his entire ear, and then gifted it to a prostitute. It's a story of passion, pain, and profound instability. Like many of these myths, this one is an exaggeration that misses the weirder, more pathetic truth. Van Gogh did indeed have a violent, self-harming episode in December of 1888, after a terrible fight with his fellow artist, Paul Gauguin. He did take a razor to his head, but he didn't cut off his entire ear. The most reliable evidence, including the doctor's report and a drawing he made of the wound, suggests that he severed his earlobe, or possibly a significant portion of the lower part of the ear. It was a serious, bloody, and deeply disturbing act of self-mutilation, but it wasn't a full-on de-earing. The image of him with a completely smooth side of his head is a product of our imagination, amplifying the drama. And the part about giving it to a prostitute? That's also a bit of a simplification. He did deliver the bloody piece of his flesh to a woman, but her name was Gabrielle Berlatier, and she was likely a maid at a local brothel, not a sex worker herself. He wrapped the piece of ear in paper and told her to keep this object carefully. She fainted, and the police were called. So he didn't sever his entire hearing apparatus. He just performed the most gruesome and unasked-for DIY piercing in history, and then used it to traumatize a local cleaning lady. Number 1. The apple of Newton's eye. It's one of the most famous eureka moments in the history of science. Isaac Newton is sitting under a tree, minding his own business, perhaps contemplating why wigs were a good idea, when an apple suddenly detaches from a branch and bonks him right on the head. In that instant of mild head trauma, inspiration strikes. He understands that the same force that pulled the apple to the ground is the force that keeps the moon in orbit around the Earth. Boom. Gravity. It's a perfect, simple story of genius. A falling fruit literally knocks an idea into the world's smartest brain. The only problem is, the apple on the head part is an embellishment added later to make the story punchier. Newton himself told the story of the apple, but his version was far less cartoonish. According to the accounts of his contemporaries, Newton was in his garden when he saw an apple fall from a tree. He wasn't sitting directly under it. The sight of the apple falling made him wonder, why did it fall straight down? Why not sideways or upwards? He reasoned there must be a drawing power in the earth. He then began to wonder if that same power extended further, much further. Could it be the same force that held the moon in its orbit? That was the real genius leap. It wasn't the observation of a falling apple. It was the question of whether that simple, everyday force was also a universal cosmic one. The myth of the apple bonk was popularized by writers like Voltaire because it made for a much better story. It turns a long, complex process of contemplation, calculation, and revolutionary thought into a single, relatable moment of slapstick discovery. Gravity wasn't discovered by head trauma. It was the result of a guy staring at fruit from a distance and having a thought so big it would take him another 20 years and an entirely new branch of mathematics to fully explain it. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.